So I'll go ahead and introduce Hilary while everybody finds their way back to their seats. So we put this presentation in the agenda. I don't know that everybody recognizes the efforts that Oxy has put out in the carbon management space. And so you heard this morning, not only is there an imperative to create wealth with the activities that you do, but decarbonization. And so Oxy has really blended these two together, sort of in a short, medium, and long-term framework that I'll let Hilary describe. She's another OU graduate. You can read her bio in the program agenda, but Hilary, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, can you guys hear me? All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today about a company that I certainly love and think is doing some really incredible work in the carbon capture space. I'm especially excited to be back because I am from Oklahoma and I currently live in Washington, D.C., and I don't get back home nearly as much as my mother would like. So she's grateful too. So I am the Senior Director of Government Affairs at Occidental Petroleum, based in the D.C. office, and I spend most of my time talking to legislators and regulators and trying to educate them about what it is that we do in the industry. The easy way to think of it is they're going to write laws, they're going to write regulations, and I want to make sure that the people that are doing that are as educated as possible. So that's part of what my job is. I want to start the conversation today with a little bit about who we are as Occidental, and then we'll go into more detail with the carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, and the newly formed Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. That was all of the legal jargon. So most people have never heard of Oxy, maybe before yesterday's announcement, because we are not consumer-facing. So we don't have gas stations, we don't have products on the shelves. We are mainly an exploration and production company with a small midstream footprint. And in the US domestically, we only operate in the Permian Basin. So we're only in Texas and New Mexico. And then overseas, we're in the UAE, Oman, and Colombia in South America. And then we have our global headquarters in Houston. We are one of the largest oil and gas companies in the United States, producing about 650,000 BOE per day, and we employ nearly 38,000 employees and contractors globally. We also have a pretty substantial chemical business, OxyChem, and we are a leading manufacturer of basic chemicals used in water treatment, plastics, and pharmaceuticals. So we're also a unique company because we are the world's largest consumer of CO2. There we go. We have over 40 years experience in separating, compressing, transporting, and injecting CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. So when compared against some of these other oil and gas companies, you can see that we have more CO2 projects in the higher producing wells. We inject about 2.6 billion cubic feet a day of CO2 from naturally occurring, anthropogenic, and recycled sources. So that's about 50 million metric tons per year. And of that 50 million metric tons, about 18 million metric tons is stored in the geology of the rock. So what does that mean in real terms? 18 million metric tons is the equivalent of about 4 million passenger vehicles on the road. So Tesla last year made about 250,000 cars. Last year, we took off the equivalent of 4 million cars. So Permian Resources is the largest focus of all of Oxy's businesses. As you can see from the slide, we have a significant presence in the basin totaling around 2.7 million acres. We have 34 active CO2 floods and another 70 water floods that, given the right market conditions, could potentially be developed into CO2 floods. Our net production related to CO2 is 155 BOE. Additionally, we have 14 gas processing plants that can separate CO2 for recycling and reuse, and over 2,500 dedicated miles of CO2 pipeline. Oh, there we go. So I know that this has been talked about a little bit, but I want to get a little bit more into the details about what is EOR with carbon capture and how does it work. So after primary and secondary recovery methods stop producing hydrocarbons economically, we turn to CO2 as a tertiary recovery method in some of our floods. We look to a number of factors to indicate whether CO2 EOR can be effectively applied at a given reservoir. So among other things, we consider the geology at the reservoir, the physical characteristics of the oil, the production history, condition, and accessibility of the field. Using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, we can get anywhere from 10 to 25% more oil out of the ground, and that's oil that otherwise would not have been recoverable. So we start with compressed CO2. When you take carbon dioxide and you put it under enormous amounts of pressure, it changes from a gas to something with more liquid-like properties. So we can transport it more easily, and it doesn't take up as much space. Now, because it doesn't take up as much space, we can store more of it underground. So we inject the compressed CO2 into the oil reservoir, where the CO2 mixes with the oil. That changes the oil's viscosity, so some of that oil that otherwise would be stuck actually flows more easily. In this depiction, you see the water is blue, CO2 is yellow, and the oil is red. It's not a great depiction, but you get the idea. So depending upon reservoir conditions, you can use the WAG method, which is water alternating gas injection. Because CO2 has this low viscosity, it can move its way around rock, or it's called fingering through the rock. The WAG method makes it so that the oil and the water, or the oil and the CO2 mix more easily, and then the water can come through and flush that newly freed oil to the production well. So as you can see, first, the pressurized water is used to fracture the rock and release the hydrocarbons. Then the CO2 either mixes with the oil or it displaces the oil in the pore space. Some of that CO2 is pushed to the production well, and the remaining CO2 is trapped underground. There are a number of ways for CO2 to actually stay trapped underground. Dissolution trapping refers to when the CO2 actually dissolves into some of the water that's naturally in the rock. Some of the CO2 gets stuck in the pore space, and this is called residual trapping. Over time, some of the CO2 will interact with the reservoir rock and actually create a new mineral, and that's mineral trapping. So any of these methods and a few others are ways that we can tell how the CO2 stays underground. So after water and CO2 are injected, gas, oil, and water are produced through the production well. Oil heads to market, the water is treated and either disposed or re-injected, and the produced gas is further separated and, if economic, sold on the market. The CO2 is separated, recompressed, and re-injected for continued hydrocarbon recovery. Now, this is also critical in ensuring that we're maintaining the proper pressure in the reservoir. We have to maintain the proper withdrawal and injection rate because we want to make sure that we can continue to monitor and verify how much CO2 is actually sequestered. And by maintaining that rate of what we put in versus what comes out and creating the right pressure, we can be fairly certain what stays there. So I'll discuss a little bit more about how we monitor and verify. But first, I just want to show, this is the full closed loop system sort of from a big picture perspective. So as I mentioned, we have been doing this for over 40 years. We employ extensive modeling techniques to understand properties of CO2 in reservoirs and to ensure that we're being prudent and safe operators. We conduct seismic monitoring, and we do extensive underground simulation modeling to map out, characterize, and understand our reservoirs. That work provides a basic understanding of how the CO2 will act underground once it's injected. Employees on the ground are also equipped with H2S monitors. So if H2S is detected, we know to look for CO2 leaks. Because we have gas processing facilities, that enables us to handle all of the produced CO2 and create this closed loop system. So eventually, all the CO2 that you inject will remain underground. Associated storage of CO2 through enhanced oil recovery has been cited as having huge storage potential for CO2 emissions by many well-regarded organizations. We've calculated some 320 million metric tons of storage at just 2 of our units, the Denver unit and the Hobbs fields. We see it as critically important in decreasing atmospheric emissions, and we as Oxy think this is the right thing to do. So I've told you that all the CO2 that we use becomes sequestered, and we've discussed the way that carbon stays underground. But how do we know all this? In order to claim credit for sequestering carbon dioxide, an operator has to submit a plan to EPA, and the EPA has to approve it. Oxy has 2 MRV plans: monitoring, reporting, and verification. These MRV plans employ various methods to quantify the amount of CO2 being injected and demonstrate secure geologic storage of the injected CO2. You can see that some of the criteria includes evaluation of geology, risk assessment, and demonstration of long-term storage. We worked really closely with EPA in developing the criteria needed for plan approval, and we think we have a pretty good system. It protects the public health and the environment, and it retains public trust, which is a key factor that we think is really important moving forward. The MRV process is fully transparent, which is also another important factor in maintaining the public trust. Once a company submits, there's a comment period, so anyone can submit a comment about the activities in the reservoir. Anyone can access our MRV plans in case you want some light reading later. Plus, one of the most important things about this is when we were doing our MRV plans, we were able to finalize them without drilling any new wells, without hiring new employees, without buying new equipment, and without reconfiguring any new equipment. Because we've been doing this for such a long time, we've really developed the expertise over time to do it well and to do it very efficiently. But this also speaks volumes about the flexibility within the MRV plans and the requirements. One thing that we see as critically important is that other companies continue to look at and develop and get MRV plans approved. We want other companies to be able to do the same thing because the success of long-term storage depends on it. According to the IEA, carbon capture and utilization technologies will play an important part in meeting energy and climate goals. And I know that there was mention earlier of the Sustainable Development Scenario, and CCUS accounts for about 7% of emissions reductions needed globally. So this implies, as has been said today, a rapid scale-up in this technology. CO2 EOR is the first commercially available technology that will bring down the cost of capture. And Oxy's Low Carbon Ventures group is working hard to find ways to deploy carbon capture technology more quickly and more economically. So here's just sort of a big picture what the CO2 supply chain looks like. And this is in large part what led to the creation of Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. So in 2018, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures was created to develop partnerships with CO2 sources and allow for the purchase and use of more CO2 in our sequestration. Low Carbon Ventures serves a dual purpose: to enhance Oxy's profitability and provide shareholder value in the transition to a low-carbon economy, and to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint, and to help others do the same. Our goal is to lower the cost of capture so that we can make more widespread capture and use of CO2. So I've spoken a little bit about our EOR and carbon sequestration, but Low Carbon Ventures, or LCV, goes beyond that. It's pursuing innovative low-carbon business solutions via investment in technology for carbon capture, decarbonizing the electricity market, and deploying new developments for direct air capture technology. Low Carbon Ventures is also looking at opportunities to utilize CO2 as a feedstock to create products such as CO2 to plastics, or using CO2 as a feedstock for fuels to help decarbonize the historically difficult transportation sector. Due in part to the work of LCV, just last month, Oxy announced a goal of becoming carbon neutral. We think it's the right thing to do long term, and we can make a business out of it. The IEA's analysis suggests that using CO2 for EOR, using industrial CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, can result in a 63 net reduction of CO2 emissions for every barrel of oil produced. So we're starting with options for industrial CO2 capture, and we're working on ways to make that more commercially viable. Now, in 2018, Congress passed edits to the 45Q tax credit, and I know that was mentioned a little bit earlier. That program has directly and indirectly led to a number of partnerships. I'll speak a little bit more about 45Q and the work in Congress later, but first I want to discuss how passage of that legislation led to really exciting partnerships with some unconventional allies to increase domestic production and decrease emissions. So Oxy really is an all-of-the-above energy company. We use natural gas and coal for electricity. We partner with ethanol. Some of our OxyChem chemical facilities actually use hydrogen as a co-generation technology. Hydrogen is one of the byproducts for the chemical process, and we can use that hydrogen to power the chemical process. And we're expanding into solar. About a third of our costs for enhanced oil recovery are electric generation. And we are currently installing a 16-megawatt solar facility at our Goldsmith unit, which will reduce Scope 1 emissions and help with energy efficiency. So this is one I really love to talk about because most people don't expect the oil company to talk about ethanol, but we are actually big fans of ethanol. Last year, we announced a feasibility study with White Energy, which is a biofuels company in Texas and Kansas. The study would outline the feasibility and the ways that we could take the ethanol the CO2 from the ethanol facility and use it in our enhanced oil recovery operations. That project could potentially sequester 1 million tons of CO2 per year. So back to our passenger vehicle. If each passenger vehicle is about 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide a year, a project like this has the potential to remove about 200,000 cars a year from an emissions standpoint. This project is an important first step in cross-industry collaboration to make carbon capture economic, practicable, and scalable. In November, Oxy joined with Exelon, McDermott, and 8 Rivers to partner with Net Power. Net Power is a zero atmospheric emission natural gas power generation facility. It's located just outside of Houston in La Porte, Texas, and it is some really, really exciting new technology. It's oxy combustion technology that's not typically been employed because it's been expensive. But by capturing and reusing the CO2 into the combustor, Net Power has created a cheaper, cleaner alternative to traditional natural gas power. It combines an oxygen-methane combustion technology with CO2 as a high-temperature working fluid and inherently captures all the carbon dioxide. This technology, known as the alum cycle, generates zero atmospheric emissions. The byproducts are water, nitrogen, argon, and pipeline-ready CO2. Oxy sees potential for a pure stream of CO2 to be utilized in our enhanced oil recovery operations. Net Power's power generation technology with inherent carbon capture really complements Occidental's leadership in CO2 utilization and sequestration, making us ideal partners to tackle carbon emissions worldwide. And I know that there's been a little mention about direct air capture technology. Just earlier this year, actually, I think it was January, Oxy announced a partnership in British Columbia-based Carbon Engineering, which is a company that does direct air capture technology. This technology pulls CO2 directly from the atmosphere, uses a complex chemical process to separate out that CO2 from other gases. That CO2 can then be used for a number of purposes, including enhanced oil recovery. The direct air capture plants are location independent and can be co-located with an oil field for enhanced oil recovery. Using atmospheric CO2 for EOR operations greatly reduces the carbon footprint of your traditional barrel of oil and opens a pathway to producing a fully carbon neutral or even a carbon negative barrel of oil. We believe we can find enough commercial applications to economically source CO2 directly from the air, and that's really exciting stuff. So now I want to talk a little bit about 45Q and some of the tax incentives for carbon capture. Many of these opportunities and these partnerships would not have been possible without changes to the tax code that incentivized carbon capture. The Future Act passed last year as part of the bipartisan budget bill, and it included language to extend and make some changes to an existing tax credit under 45Q for those who capture carbon emissions and show permanent geologic storage or beneficial use. In large part, the credit works to offset the upfront costs of the carbon capture equipment. The language also expanded credit to allow for direct air capture, like the technology from carbon engineering. In order to claim 45Q, a company must have an EPA plan approved outlining the requirements for the MRV. Oxy encourages peer regulators and the public who are interested in this space to read them. As I mentioned, the more companies that have MRV, the more people utilize 45Q. Then it's a lot easier to go back and work with Congress on some of these other issues that we'll talk about. So we worked closely with the bipartisan members of the House and Senate to gather support for and ultimately to pass this legislation. And what's really exciting is the breadth of interest that we saw from both sides of the aisle all across the country. We had Senator Whitehouse, who's a Democrat from Rhode Island, co-sponsoring this legislation with Senator Barrasso, who's a Republican from Wyoming. And just for context, Senator Whitehouse is known for going to the floor of the Senate every single day and talking about climate change and talking about the challenges of climate change. So when you have these two people that are really working toward the same cause, that says a lot, especially in Washington where no one agrees on anything right now. So Congress and the administration have played an important role in our expansion into low-carbon ventures, but there's certainly more that can be accomplished. Now, apart from the members of Congress, 45Q brought together all sorts of non-traditional allies to form a broad coalition supporting carbon capture and sequestration. We worked through the Carbon Capture Coalition, which is a group of 60 companies, organizations, and associations to gather support for the legislation. So we continue to work with the Carbon Capture Coalition, and you can see that there's some really interesting bedfellows here. Labor, coal, oil and gas, renewables, environmental NGOs. We're all working together for policies to advance this issue. And we have been really successful. Oxy is especially proud to work with such a diverse group, and we think it has great potential to move the needle on deployment of carbon capture technology. The things that we're continuing to think about, what are the next steps for the coalition? We talked about transport and infrastructure of CO2. Are there ways to get more capture equipment on more industrial sources? How can carbon capture become part of the solution to climate change, and how can we talk about it in those terms? I also want to talk about the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. So in addition to these non-traditional allies that I just discussed, we continue to work with other oil and gas companies on climate solutions. Last fall, we announced that we would join OGCI as one of the first US companies to get involved. There are 13 member companies led by CEOs who are active in promoting emissions reductions. OGCI members make up about 30% of production globally, and we're present in 130 countries. We collectively invested about $6 billion to lower emissions in our operations. And as part of the membership, we contribute funds for the Climate Investment Fund of OGCI to invest in new technology that avoids emissions altogether and uses emissions as a feedstock in other processes. So I want to end with this map of CO2 sources and discuss the potential for increased use of CO2 sequestration and storage. Oklahoma, according to EPA's data from 2018, Oklahoma releases 55 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. 37 million of those tons come from power plants and refineries. Additionally, Oklahoma already has smaller CO2 pipeline infrastructure that connects industrial sources of CO2. Last year, Governor Fallin joined a group of other governors from Wyoming and Montana and some other states to consider ways to support and encourage carbon capture at home. There's a lot of potential here in Oklahoma to act on emissions in a way that continues to support the fossil fuel industry. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this space to take a look at Oxy Low Carbon Ventures website And if you're feeling adventurous, our MRV plans. But actually, the MRV plans, they're about 50 pages. They're very readable, and I actually think they're quite interesting. And if you just Google EPA, MRV plan, and Oxy, they'll be the first things to come up. At Oxy, we want to make CCUS technology economic and feasible across the globe. But we think that we can start with opportunities here in Texas and New Mexico and Oklahoma. I'm thrilled to be a part of a company that's working to decrease emissions and increase production of reliable domestic sources of energy. At Oxy, we want to enhance profitability and shareholder value in the transition to a low-carbon economy. We think it's the right thing to do, and we certainly hope that the industry thinks so too. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take those. Yes? Yep, so we saw the bipartisan budget bill passed in March of 2018, so just over a year ago. We're still waiting on guidance from the IRS, which has been frustrating, but we are continuing to work with them. They have to put out some guidance on things like what does it mean to commence construction. So once they get that out, we'll have a lot more certainty moving forward with what our timeframes look like. And then from a production standpoint from CO2, so we are 650,000 BOE per day, and about 155,000 of that is from enhanced oil recovery. 25% is that the percentage? I'm not great at math. Right around there. Yes. 155 of 650. So right now it's just in the Permian Basin, but we're looking at international opportunities too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. She already knows I'm going to ask her this.
Equivalent, CO2 equivalent. Mm-hmm. We would think so. And, especially if you look at the map and you can kind of see where Oklahoma is and what it looks like, there's certain concentrations there which make it a lot easier if you're looking at it from a pipeline perspective. I'm sorry, we put it into a liquid form. Correct. Yes. Yeah, so we compress it so that it has those, I don't think, it never actually turns into a liquid, but it becomes supercritical CO2, so it has liquid-like properties. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Mm-hmm.
Chemical structure of it. If we look at the chemical structure of it, part of the end product of liquefied, let me call it liquefied carbon dioxide, will be hydrogen. What happens to that hydrogen during that process? Because if you look at the if you draw the chemistry of it, chemical symbol for it, hydrogen will be one of the end products. What happened to that hydrogen?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure we could figure it out, but I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Okay, Hilary, I'm going to switch gears here.
Okay.
So you've been on the Hill for 8 years. What is the biggest challenge for you to try to get the Republicans and the Democrats when it comes to energy policy to work and across the aisle?
Yeah, the rhetoric. The rhetoric is the hardest thing. I find that going in and talking to Republicans, everyone says, we have to find a solution to climate change. Can you help us? And of course, we talk about carbon capture, and people are thrilled. We actually just had a meeting with Mr. Conaway, who's a member of Congress from Texas, and we talked a lot about our partnerships with white energy and ethanol, and so people are really excited to hear that work. And the same thing on the Democrat side, because while you do have people that want to talk about the Green New Deal, you have a lot of really reasonable Democrats that recognize that that's never going to happen. And in fact, I don't know if anyone actually read the Green New Deal here besides me, but only 18% of that legislation had anything to do with climate or energy. So you have people on both sides that really want solutions, and we talk a lot about how you can find those in reasonable ways with things like carbon capture. But it's really difficult when you have rhetoric from both sides that are pushing people farther outside. Yeah.
Hi. What is your break-even oil price on these projects, and how will this tax credit impact that?
So our overall break-even is about $40. Really, the tax credit goes to the emission source, the point source. So really what that does is it's incentivized people to build and maintain capture equipment that otherwise wouldn't have an incentive to do that. It's creating more CO2 available for us. So hopefully what that will do is increase our production down the line. But the tax credit, which is $35 for a ton that's ultimately going to be sequestered via CO2, or $50 via a ton that's going to go to saline storage, that goes directly to the capture point. Okay. Good. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.